Mecklenburg Correctional Center was supposed to be escape-proof, but in 1984, the unexplainable happened, and Mecklenburg met its match, a gang of 6 death row inmates who had nothing more to lose. The gang was led by the infamous Briley Brothers, whose history involved an atrocious killing spree and many other gruesome crimes. The prisoners' careful consideration and planning resulted in what was deemed one of the boldest, most elaborate escapes in U.S. history. For 3 weeks, the state of Virginia trembled, fearing the Briley brothers' endless cruelty, and when authorities finally managed to catch them, everyone breathed a little more easily. Viewers' discretion is advised. It was almost evening on May 31st, 1984, and all was not right at Mecklenburg Correctional Center in Virginia. Unbeknownst to the prison guards, an evil plan was just about to be put into motion by a rowdy gang of 6 inmates. Linwood and James Briley, Lem Tuggle, Earl Clanton, Derek Peterson, and Wiley Jones had all been sentenced to death, but they weren't going to sit around and wait for justice to be served. All 6 men were killers of vile reputations, but the worst of them were by far the Briley brothers, who seemed to rule over the entire death row. Back in 1979, Linwood and James Briley, their younger brother Anthony, and an accomplice, Duncan Meekins, had been part of a ruthless 7-month killing spree in their hometown of Richmond, Virginia. Their killing spree took 11 lives that we know of and left many others in distress. The brothers and their accomplice were all arrested soon after committing the last murders. Duncan Meekins and Anthony Briley were given life sentences in prison because there was not enough proof that any of them had personally committed the murders. Linwood and James Briley were both sentenced to death. Evidence showed Linwood and James were both directly responsible for committing the murders. They were sent to death row in Mecklenburg Correctional Center in early 1980. By now, it was time to leave their past behind and start fresh, away from Mecklenburg. By all accounts, Linwood Briley was the mastermind behind the escape plan. In 1984, at 30 years old, Linwood was charismatic, smart, and merciless. His brother James, who was 28, was far more placid and incapable of devising a complex plan. According to various descriptions, James had the face of a man who was born to die in the electric chair. He wasn't bright like Linwood, and he was cold. So it fell to Linwood to think things through, get the necessary resources for the escape, and gather up the other inmates. Finding people willing to break out of prison wasn't hard at all. After all, these men were sentenced to death. Even more, Linwood was popular and feared, which certainly helped convince the others. With Tuggle, Clanton, Peterson, and Jones now in tow, freedom was just around the corner. The men could probably almost taste it, and there was nothing that could hold them back. There had been some recent trouble, some months ago. Several other inmates had alerted prison officials about the Brileys' plan to break out of Mecklenburg. As a result, the prison officials instituted a general lockdown from April 1984 until the end of May, when bureaucrats and human rights watchers pressured the officials to put a stop to the lockdown. And now, it was time for the Brileys' plan to become a reality. It was an evening on May 31st. Earl Clanton was the first one out of the 6 to act. As inmates were going back to the cell blocks for the night, Clanton slipped out of the line and into a bathroom adjacent to the control room. Then he proceeded to lock himself in the bathroom, unnoticed by any of the guards. A while later, at about 9 p.m., James Briley asked the guard in the control room if the man could retrieve a book for him in the locked day room. The guard left to retrieve the book, and that's when James Briley and Clanton attacked, overpowering the officer. After they took hold of the control room, James and Clanton started hitting buttons, essentially unlocking the cells and opening doors. Mayhem ensued, but it was only the beginning. The Brileys had spent months, even years, studying the prison guards, their patterns, their behaviors, their protocols, even their personal gestures. This gave the prisoners a huge advantage. It meant they knew where to go, when to go, and how to proceed overall. With all the doors in the unit now unlocked, and the feeling of insurgency in the air, the inmates easily overpowered the prison guards. The guards were stripped of their clothes, tied up, and forced in the cells. The 6 inmates changed into uniforms and started acting like guards. This was the next step of the prisoners' plan. They had to act like guards and radio officers in the areas of the prison. The reason was simple. They wanted to lure all officers to the building they now controlled. Each time a guard entered the unit, the convicts attacked them. They had weapons. The Brileys and their accomplices spent months turning lawn equipment into deadly devices. Each time a guard would show up to the building, James Briley and Lem Tuggle threatened them with makeshift blades. There were instances of mercy. The older Briley meant to sexually assault a prison nurse, but he was also stopped by another inmate. Officer Coraline Epps, who had just had a baby, also feared she was about to be raped and killed, but she too had an unlikely protector. Despite being one of the 6 inmates who had planned the entire escape, Earl Clanton came to Epps' defense, telling her quietly that he was a dad. "I'm not going to let anyone come in here and hurt you. You have my word," Clanton told the woman. Then he proceeded to stay in front of the door, protecting her. As the minutes passed, the Brileys knew they were getting closer to their escape, but in order to reach the second portion of their plan, they needed the presence of one guard in particular. Then, they saw the man entering the building. One of the 6 inmates ambushed the officer, putting a blade to his throat. He had to listen and obey if he wanted to live. With the blade still pressed to his throat, the officer called other prison officials and told them the inmates had assembled a bomb and he needed to get it out of the prison before it detonated. He also asked for a prison van to be sent to the back of the unit so that the bomb could be carried away safely. Meanwhile, the Brileys and the other 4 inmates had to find something that could easily pass for a bomb. They raided a closet and put on riot gear. This way, their faces would be unseen by the prison guards they might encounter along the way. Then they placed a television on a gurney and covered it with a blanket. Their so-called bomb looked authentic enough. It was time to leave this hellhole, but not before getting fire extinguishers too. Just another touch of authenticity to their ruse. Linwood Briley, James Briley, Lynn Tuggle, Earl Clanton, Derek Peterson, and Willie Jones exited the building carrying the gurney. The van was waiting for them at the back of the building. Nobody even batted an eye at the 6 men. They looked the part of prison officials carrying a bomb. Then the men entered the van and away they went. The guard in charge of opening the prison's 2 sets of gates had her suspicions about the van, but in the end, she let the vehicle pass. And then, the 6 killers were out, free at last. They had $800 between the 6 of them because they had raided the pockets of each and every prison guard they'd come across. They had cigarettes and clothes, and a strong intention of heading up north to Canada, a country that abhorred capital punishment and wouldn't have extradited anyone who would be sent back to a country to be executed. Eventually, the 6 inmates abandoned the van and split up. By then, the manhunt was already on. There was no bush, door creak, sound, or rumor left unchecked. Earl Clanton Jr. and Derek Peterson were caught first, the day after the breakout. Lem Tuggle Jr. and Willie Leroy Jones almost managed to get to Canada, but they too were soon captured by the police. The Briley brothers were harder to catch, but in the end, they too were apprehended. They stuck together and might have even managed to escape, were it not for Lem Tuggle. Once he was caught, Tuggle told officers the Brileys were dropped off outside Philadelphia. Police knew the 2 brothers had family there. When a tap line on a Briley Brothers acquaintance in New York showed a phone call from a Philadelphia garage, police knew they had the brothers in the bag. The Brileys were barbecuing chicken in the alley when they were arrested. None of the 6 inmates are alive today. They were all executed after being recaptured. Both Linwood and James Briley were executed in the electric chair at the Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond. Linwood was executed in October 1984, while James was executed in April 1985. Earl Clanton's execution was carried out in April 1988. Derek Peterson's execution followed in August 1991. Willie Leroy Jones was executed in the electric chair in September 1992. The last of the 6 to die was Lem Tuggle, who chose lethal injection. He was executed on December 12, 1996. His final words were, "Merry Christmas."